Good morning, everyone, and I'd like to welcome you to today's session, a practical approach to working with teens and young adults affected by trauma and attachment. My name is Dr. Les Ross. I'm one of the assistant directors at Nova Southeastern University, Tampa Bay Regional Campus in Clearwater, Florida. And I have one of my colleagues that's going to introduce herself in a moment. We're working today with our partners at Camelot Community Care, which is an outstanding organization here in the state of Florida. And they'll be talking to you here very shortly as well. Nova Southeastern University, we do offer a plethora of counseling and psychology degrees online and on-site and in hybrid formats ranging from bachelor's, master's, specialist, and doctorate degrees. We're going to put our contact information in the chat box, myself and my colleague, and please feel free to reach out to us at any time. If you just want just some information, no pressure, just ask questions. And we will be glad to assist you at any time. Kelsey?
Hi, everybody. My name is Kelsey Troncalli, and I am also one of the assistant directors along with Dr. Les Ross at the Tampa Bay Regional Campus. It's so nice to have you all here this morning on this beautiful Saturday, and I hope you guys enjoy the presentation. If you guys have any questions about any of our programs, please feel free to reach out. We'd be more than happy to talk to you.
And next, I'd like to welcome Michael from Camelot.
Good morning, everybody. I'm Michael DeBreezy. I'm the Chief Executive Officer of Camelot Community Care. And first, thank you to Nova Southeastern University for this fantastic partnership and for inviting us today. We have two of our great team members, Krista and Austin, who are part of the panel. And they've given me a few seconds to tell a little bit about us. Camelot is a multi-state behavioral health and child welfare program in Florida and Ohio and from other states from time to time. We primarily focus, we're entirely focused on working with children who have experienced abuse, neglect, domestic violence, substance abuse. All of our programs are community-based. We go out and see children and families in their homes, in school, where they work. We operate treatment foster care programs, as well as we do provide some services in different facilities, but we're going in there to be able to try to provide some overlay services. So we have a large mental health program, a behavioral health program. We're fortunate to have a number of Nova Southeastern interns over time. We love when we have them. And our organization is throughout the entire state of Florida, from Tallahassee all the way down to Miami. We have offices and programs everywhere. And if you're interested in learning more about us, please go to our website, www.camelotcommunitycare.org. I hope you enjoyed the presentation. Again, thank you to NSU for allowing us to be part of this today.
Thank you. And we will have some focused discussion, and then we'll go into a panel and questions and answers. So if you have any questions later on, feel free to add them in the chat, and we will address your questions. Dr. Patrick Powell.
Hello, everybody. My name is Dr. Patrick Powell. I'm a faculty member at Nova Southeastern in the College of Psychology in the counseling department. Go Sharks for any of you that are Nova students. Thank you all for taking the time to meet with us. I know it is rather early. For my part of this presentation, I'm going to talk about trauma and try to give a brief overview of what the trauma process actually is and how that can impact children as they develop. So I'm going to go ahead and just share my screen with you for a moment and walk through a very brief presentation. Oh, I think Carlos might need to. No? Okay, well, I'll just talk my way through it. So let's talk for a moment about trauma. For those of you that are in the trauma field, you might be surprised to learn that the original origin of the word trauma comes from the Greek culture. Trauma means to wound or hurt. When we talk about what is trauma, people have traumatic reactions when they experience an event that overwhelms their ability to cope and manage that situation.
Dr. Powell, Dr. Perez just allowed you permission to share in the event that you want to for those viewing.
I say, why not? So when we talk about trauma, again, it's an event that overwhelms our natural ability to cope and manage our stress or the situation. Let's start right there. SAMHSA provided an excellent definition, and it impacts us entirely. When we experience trauma, it impacts our physical well-being. A lot of people have higher degrees of anxiety afterwards. It impacts our emotional well-being. Many people feel emotionally numb. It impacts our intellectual well-being. It often impacts our spiritual well-being. Some people will have a doubt in terms of their faith. So it impacts us on an entirely holistic level. There are a number of events we would call traumatic events that occur. Some people are going to experience these events and they may not develop a traumatic reaction. Other people might develop a traumatic reaction. Some examples of traumatic events: sexual assault, sexual abuse, when people are in domestic violence situations, when there's natural disasters, when people are in areas where there is frequent war or community violence. You know, one of the things that we've seen time and time again is in situations that have interpersonal violence, those situations tend to have more of a potential to lead to a traumatic reaction. When you look at, say, natural disasters, things like that, you often have a community. You have people that can meet you and have shared the same experience that you have, and you can come together and that sort of thing. Take hurricanes, tornadoes, that sort of thing. But when there is interpersonal violence, the chance for traumatization, or rather a traumatic reaction to some of these traumatic events, increases. When you have individuals that dissociate during a traumatic event, and I'll explain dissociation here in just a second. When you have individuals that dissociate during a traumatic event, the chance for PTSD or some of these other traumatic reactions increases. For those of you that are unfamiliar with dissociation, everyone viewing this has dissociated at some point. If you've ever driven home and you've been listening to a song you really like or something, and you get home and you can't remember how you got there, you dissociated to a small degree. For some people that experience significant traumatic events, they dissociate to a larger degree. Some people will sort of step out of their body or their experience. For just a moment, I'm going to talk with you all about the mechanism for traumatization. It's called the instinctual trauma response. For those of you that are in the trauma field, you're probably familiar with this already. For just about everyone, we have a natural response when we sense danger, or when we sense a threat, or when we sense that we're in trouble. We either flee or we fight. That's the natural response. For people that are able to do one of those things, flee or fight, the chance of traumatization decreases. For those individuals that are not, they may enter into a dissociative state where they are stuck, for lack of a better phrase. That's the start for many people for PTSD or some of the other traumatic reactions we're going to talk about. When people freeze, that's the, again, origin point for dissociation and the origin point for many of the other symptoms we're going to talk about here in just a moment. You know, one thing that I try to stress to people, though, is that not everyone that experiences a traumatic event is going to develop a traumatic reaction like PTSD. There are plenty of individuals who have higher levels of resiliency who may not. When we look at some of these resiliency factors, when people have intense level of support from family, friends, or community members, people in their school, people in their environment, they may have a higher level of resiliency to developing a traumatic reaction. When people have a higher level of safety, wherever they are in their environment, home, school, if they feel that level of safety, again, the chances are less they'll develop a traumatic reaction. If a person has a higher level of self-esteem, if they have a higher level of self-worth, again, great resiliency factor. If a person has a high level of self-efficacy, and if that term is unfamiliar to you, self-efficacy is the ability to set a goal and meet that goal on your own. For people that have cultural or spiritual beliefs, for people that have a community, but those beliefs may bring some meaning to that situation. And again, the chances of a traumatic reaction like PTSD are lessened. For people that have a talent or skill, something that individual might evidence, I have a self-worth, again, less of a chance for a traumatic reaction. And for people that have coping skills that they can apply whenever they're fearful, whenever they're upset, whenever they feel shame, or whenever they feel anxiety, those individuals have a higher likelihood of not developing a traumatic reaction. Now, that being said, you know, if a person has any number of these factors, it doesn't mean that they will not develop a traumatic reaction or PTSD or something like that. It just means there's a higher likelihood that they will not. For just a moment, I want to transition and talk about the impact of trauma. I know I briefly alluded to it earlier. When we talk about trauma, there are a number of things that happen within us. And we're going to discuss some of those. It can cause your individual alarm system to no longer function like it should. If any of you have ever been in a movie theater and you've sat there and you've watched a movie and you've heard a door shut behind you, you've probably jumped. And you've turned around, you've looked to see who was there, and you realize it's just someone coming into the movie. And then you go back and watch your movie. For an individual that's experienced trauma, they're likely or easier to startle, and it's going to be a little more difficult for them to come back down because they're going to remain more vigilant. It can create some extreme emotional and physical responses to stress. We're going to talk about this here in just a little bit, but for some individuals, they can develop significant body sensations due to hypertension. It can lead to increased anxiety issues, heart palpitations, a number of issues. It can result in emotional numbing. Some individuals that experience trauma may reach a place where they feel nothing, because for some individuals, nothing is better than feeling anxiety and worry all the time. Likewise, for some individuals, they may reach a place of psychological avoidance where they avoid addressing the issue in general. If someone's been in a car accident, they may avoid going by places that have body shops where cars are being repaired or that sort of thing. If someone wants to talk about the issue, a person may have an extreme reaction. No, don't want to talk about this, that sort of thing. It definitely can impact a person's sense of safety. You know, one of the things that many people take for granted is that we are safe in a lot of situations. For an individual that's experienced trauma, they may no longer have that sense of safety. I'm in private practice and I'll frequently talk with clients about, do you feel safe right now? And often those clients report no, even though we're sitting in my office, which is a relatively safe environment. So we'll have to walk through safety testing in terms of what in this room feels dangerous and that sort of thing, because again, that sense of safety is just diminished for a lot of people. It also impacts a person's ability to trust others. Again, many people walk through life with a perception that people by and large are safe and that we can trust one another. But if someone has had a traumatic event, that sense of trust may no longer be there. And it may be more difficult for them to trust not only strangers, but people that are very close to them, people that they have trusted for a while. And it may be difficult for a person to trust themselves. It may be difficult for them to trust their judgment in terms of, do I know if a person is safe to be around? I'm showing you this slide from Child Trends. I think it's an important one to check out. You know, primarily I've spoken about trauma in terms of some general effects, but it's even more significant when it happens with children. The thing that I really want to stress to you about trauma is it is pervasive and it doesn't necessarily disappear. For young children that experience trauma, they move through life, their trauma compounds with new situations. And you may start to see relationship issues. You may see mental health issues like depression, anxiety. You may see behavioral issues where people withdraw from other people, where people feel aggressive with other people. There have been a lot of studies that have looked at trauma and brain development. If anyone is interested, you can shoot me an email at my NOVA address. I'll put that in the chat, and I'll be more than happy to send you some of those articles. But for young children that are traumatized, their brains simply do not develop in the same rate as other children. They also have some significant stress responses that, again, will impact their maturation. It can impact a child's cognition. Again, there may be delays in language, the ability to concentrate, the ability to problem solve. We commonly see a lot of eating disorders, shorter lifespans typically with some people with complex trauma. And in terms of emotions, kids have a difficult time regulating some of those emotions, and they may not have the same level of coping skills as other kids. And they may also have an excessive level of worry. They may also feel shame and guilt. You know, these sort of things, again, they compound over time. It's very common for me to work with adults who are coming in topically for something like depression or anxiety. But the more the person talks, and if we were to do a significant history, I start to see where this really relates back to when someone was younger, when they experienced a trauma. Just in terms of some statistics, 70% of adults have experienced some type of traumatic event at least once in their life, roughly 223.4 million people. In the public behavioral health field, 90% of clients have experienced trauma, 90%. In the US, a woman is assaulted or beaten every 15 seconds. and a forcible rape occurs every 6 minutes. More than 33% of youths exposed to community violence will experience PTSD. 90% of sexually abused children, 77% of children exposed to a school shooting, and 35% of urban youth exposed to community violence may develop PTSD. When you look at these stats, I think the thing that I would really hope that you get is, though PTSD and traumatic reactions don't really pop up a lot in terms of conversations, when we start to look at individuals that develop significant issues later in life, it's actually very common to be able to trace that back to a trauma. And some individuals will experience multiple traumas. Some individuals will experience trauma as a child, and that may be prolonged. Think about children that are in situations where they're physically abused or sexually abused over a period of time. Those same individuals may later on in life develop some unhealthy relationships and enter into domestic violence situations where they are again abused. So trauma is not only pervasive, and it not only impacts a person developmentally, trauma compounds over time. I want to take just a minute and talk about traumatic reactions and some of the labels that we use for them. I think one of the things that I really want to stress is when we talk about PTSD and that sort of thing in the clinical field, we're very used to talking about this in terms of as an illness or something along those lines. But I really want to encourage you to think about some of this as being a natural reaction to an inhospitable situation. If we had longer, I would talk with you about the PTSD process and how that is in some ways a healing process. And if you're interested in that, again, shoot me an email and I'll be more than happy to send you some of the papers on that. But let's talk about some of the common diagnoses you would see in the field. PTSD is the most common. I'm going to talk with you about just the major building blocks of those symptoms. Again, when individuals experience PTSD, they're hyper-aroused, they're more nervous, they're easier to startle, they're super quick to startle, and they stay at a higher level of excitement. Some individuals will re-experience that trauma. Now, that may be in the form of seeing that trauma visually. It might be in the form of reliving that, where people feel they're actually in that situation. For some children, it might be in the form of dreams about the situation. For some individuals, they may just have an intense feeling like fear or horror that occurred during that traumatic event, but they'll re-experience that traumatic event. Some individuals will dissociate. Again, I spoke about that earlier, but dissociation, the easiest way to explain it is someone takes a step outside of their existence. It occurs frequently with sexual assault and in other traumatic situations. And again, avoidance and withdrawal. Again, it's much easier to feel numb than to feel terrible, to feel frustrated, to feel anger, to feel anxiety. So some people just feel nothing, an emotional plateau. And some people pull away from their relationships. Even if people are supporting them, sometimes people feel that it's safer to not be in those relationships. And again, people will often avoid anything that would trigger a memory. So if someone was out with their friends and they were, say, robbed at gunpoint or something, they may no longer hang out with those friends. They may not go to that particular area where they were robbed. If they were going to a bar or movies, they may not go to the bar or movies. Some people take some pretty extreme actions to avoid being in that place. And then, of course, there's negative emotional states, shame, guilt. You know, with many of the situations that I spoke of earlier in terms of traumatic situations, most of those are obviously not a person's responsibility or a person's fault, but it's very common for people that develop PTSD to blame themselves. I got into a situation I shouldn't have, for example. And people feel an unnecessary level of shame and guilt, and that just compounds it. It compounds the post-traumatic stress. It just makes them feel worse. One of the things that I want to say, and I know my colleagues at Camelot are going to talk about treatment here in just a little bit, but one of the things that I want to say is when we think about PTSD, I recommend that anyone that is a clinician definitely explore trauma-informed care. One of the things that we see with PTSD is that memory continues to come into existence. That is your brain's way of trying to heal itself. But oftentimes a person feels that and they start to feel anxiety, terror, and they again try to push that back. When you look at almost all effective forms of trauma treatment, they include incorporating that memory while maintaining a relaxed body in a relaxed state. So if anyone out there does plan on treating people for trauma, again, definitely pursue trauma-informed care so that you can be a little more aware of how to approach someone so that they feel safe while trying to incorporate that memory. Just a couple of more diagnostic situations. Disinhibited social engagement disorder. So we see this primarily with children. When some children experience infrequent or insufficient care, they may develop this. And what I mean by that is, imagine someone that lives in a group home that never develops a secure way to attach to people. Imagine someone that is in a home that is inhospitable, where they're physically abused. Some of those children do not learn how to develop healthy attachments. For kids with disinhibited social engagement disorder, those kids are trying to form an attachment with people. The problem is, they're not doing it in a safe way. They'll walk up to just about any adult and they'll look at that person and they'll interact with unfamiliar adults in some unhealthy ways. They may have no reticence in terms of walking off with a person. They often don't look back to check to see if it's okay to be with this person like most kids do. They may be overly verbal or physical. They may hug a person. They may tell them, "I love you," the first time they meet them. They may be willing, again, to walk off with a person with no hesitation. For children that experience this traumatic reaction, it's a real concern because it's easy to see someone like this being abducted or being placed in a situation which, again, is not going to be in their best interest. In terms of one more traumatic reaction, reactive attachment disorder. For anyone that's worked in foster care, Department of Children's Services, and that sort of thing, you've likely heard this term, and you may work with some kids that have experienced some of these issues. So when we see reactive attachment disorder, we again see children that were placed in situations where, as children or adolescents, they did not receive that same continuum of care from their parents. They may have been placed again in group homes where they couldn't form healthy attachments. They may have had multiple foster home placements. They may have had some level of physical abuse, neglect, or sexual abuse. But kids with reactive attachment disorder don't really learn to attach in a way that is healthy. A lot of kids, even when they're in the face of someone that is trying to attach healthily, they're going to look at that and they're going to be afraid of that because that doesn't feel comfortable. It doesn't feel safe because they've not necessarily had that before. So when we talk about reactive attachment disorder, you may see a child that in the face of a new attachment with a caregiver, they're withdrawn. They don't really express a lot of emotion. They don't really come to that person for comfort, and they don't really respond when someone offers comfort. They may also have unexplained irritability, where when someone tries to connect or mentor them, again, they're irritable, they're aggressive, they're sad, they're afraid. Again, it's worth noting that for kids that have this particular traumatic reaction, they simply haven't had those healthy attachments. So they haven't learned what it means when someone that genuinely cares reaches out for them. It just feels weird, and it may feel anxious, and they may be afraid. So again, that's just a very, very brief overview of trauma. We're going to spend just a few minutes before we transition to our peers at Camelot to talk about some of the long-term outcomes of trauma. In terms of mental health, there are some significant outcomes. When people experience trauma, many people attempt to address that by unhealthy coping skills. So we may see high levels of drug use, high levels of alcoholism. For kids that are sexually abused, they grow up with an unhealthy idea of what sexuality is. And they don't necessarily have an idea of what a healthy sexual relationship is. So some of those individuals are going to be at risk for intimate partner violence. They may be at risk for frequent sexual partners. Some of those kids, as a result of that shame, that guilt, may develop depression, may have suicide attempts. And I haven't listed it here, but may also have anxiety. Before we go on, I want to talk about this reference you're seeing at the bottom. For anyone interested in this topic, the ACE study, the Adverse Childhood Experience Study, was conducted in 1995 to 97. And it's sort of a landmark study for understanding trauma and how children are impacted developmentally. So for anyone that is interested in this topic, I heavily encourage you to check out the ACE study. Moving on, in terms of physical wellness, When an individual experiences trauma, it impacts their entire body. It impacts their immune system. It impacts their heart rate. It impacts their nervous system. It impacts a person in just incredible ways. So we see issues like fetal death, liver disease. We see unintended pregnancies and sexually transmitted diseases that in some cases occur again because some people do not have a healthy idea of sexuality. We also see issues with attachment. For many children that are traumatized, again, their idea of what it means to connect with a person, it's not the same as some of their kids. I'm going to talk for just a moment about a secure and healthy attachment. In a secure and healthy attachment, an individual learns to love and trust another individual. They also learn how to live their lives and be happy with that life independent of other people. They do not need to be attached to that individual, and they do not need that other person for validation. That person is an add-on to their lives, something that makes it better versus a necessity or someone they feel they have to cling on to. When caregivers reject or are unresponsive to our needs, some people may develop a dismissive, avoidant attachment style. Some of you may have some experience with attachment styles, but I'll just explain some of these in a little bit more detail. For those kids that have, or adults, I guess, that have dismissive, avoidant attachment styles, they may later develop a difficulty with being open to other people. They may look rather closed off because they're not sure if they're going to get rejected. And again, they may also reject emotional overtures when people reach out, when people care for them, when people love them. Again, they may reject that because they're afraid of what's going to happen if they get rejected. Some children that experience persistent neglect or abuse may develop a fearful, avoidant attachment style. Many of these children want relationships. Well, as they become adults, they want relationships. But when it becomes serious, they withdraw because they're afraid. They don't know what that's going to look like. So they draw back, they withdraw from those relationships. Sometimes kids will have caregivers that are responsive to our needs. Sometimes they will switch though, and then they will be neglectful or dismissive. For those children, they may grow up to have an anxious, preoccupied attachment style. These kids often want to be wanted. They want to be in a relationship where someone cares for them. They may try to move super fast in relationships, maybe faster than is healthy. And they may need frequent reassurance and frequent attention from other people so that they feel loved and connected. When you think about any of the three situations that I've described, you can imagine it would be difficult to be in a relationship with this person. So children that develop these three attachment styles may have a lot of difficulty in terms of their relationships. So we briefly talked about trauma and summarized it. We explained traumatic reactions. We talked about some of the long-term consequences. There are a few things that, from my part of the presentation, I really want you to take away. Children tend to be at the highest level of risk for traumatization because not only are children typically less aware of what's happening around them and what is safe or not, but also the children, their traumatization and the social, physical, and emotional consequences compound over time. And when they reach a point of being adults, they've likely had significant issues in their life already due to that trauma. Some kids are going to have resiliency factors, other children don't. So for any of you that are clinicians, if you're working with a child that's experienced a trauma, you really might want to focus on some of those resiliency factors and trying to develop those with that child, their family, and their community. Again, for children that have experienced trauma, the earlier the treatment, the better, because again, it compounds to mental health issues, substance abuse issues, and significant health risk. And for those children that again experience traumatic issues earlier in life, it may impact the relationships that they build with their family, friends, future relationships, and even their own children. Well, I appreciate you all listening to me. I hope there was something in there that caught your attention. I'm going to hand it back to Carlos.
I would say that's extremely thorough, and it's interesting to hear how much you take in. I heard it in one of your expressions, but we're going to transition right into Krista. So Krista, we want to go ahead and we'll come back to the panel.
Absolutely. I am Krista Ackoff. I am actually the director of Camelot's Adoption Support Program. I have worked in child welfare for about 18 years now, and I'm also a parent to biological and adopted children. So I have a different perspective, and in terms of living this life of caring for a young lady who has been severely exposed to childhood trauma, abuse, neglect. So I want to add on to what Dr. Powell was talking about in regards to attachment, because attachment really is that foundation of well-being for us. It is necessary for our survival. So all of the children that we work with have been exposed to developmental trauma, even potentially in utero, to well into their young childhood, even into their teenage years, depending on when our kiddos transition out of their biological family. By the time we work with kids, they've already gone through the process of being removed from that biological family component and being put in potentially multiple other families before they get to that forever home for them. So for us as providers and clinicians to this population, it becomes much more complex and very important for us to understand trauma and attachment and understand how this works woven within our kids, even on a cellular level. So we know that the stronger the attachment or the relationship to an adult or a caregiver for a child, that gives them a greater resiliency factor, like Dr. Powell talked about, and helping them to overcome this adversity. Crazily enough, the majority of our kiddos that we work with have very small or limited attachment issues. And there's a small population that we work with that have these significant attachment issues. And attachment really is kind of like on a spectrum in terms of how it's showed outwardly, how our children express it outwardly. You know, you have like some of the symptomology that Dr. Powell had spoken about in regards to superficially engaging or overly charming or indiscriminate towards strangers, going towards, you know, people and not, you know, caring or not even thinking about if they're safe, or and not even looking at their caregiver for that affirmation, like, can I go with this person? But there's also the other end of the spectrum where kids are just completely shut off, completely removed, completely shut down, and are so lacking in this social engagement and reciprocity in relationships, because for them, that never existed. So think about it, you know, these children who were unfortunately exposed to extreme abuse, neglect from very early in life. So their prototype for their caregiver is very unnurturing, uncaring, not meeting those needs for them. And so for them, they feel very worthless and unworthy. That shame response in them is just amplified by a million, because for them, they feel like, I'm not worthy of love and care. And so they don't experience that comfort and security and that expectation of relationships and how they can be very supportive to them in their growth. And so they look at these relationships as like a hindrance, because for them, their survival skills, and that's what we usually term in our world, is the things that we see on the outside or the things that our kiddos do, the behaviors that we see, we call them survival skills because they are. They had to learn these skills in order to survive these years of abuse, neglect, until they can get to that permanent forever home. And now what do we do with it? Because we've used these skills for so long, they've kept us safe, and they could be skills like lying and stealing and not talking about emotions and shutting down and being desensitized and disassociating and all these things. And then they get to this family who is very well intended and loving and caring. And then it's like, what do we do now? Because guess what? We would think that, like, as the outside looking in, this is great. This is going to ultimately heal them. You know, they have this amazing and loving and connected relationship. They can just start working on this now. But guess what? That feels super weird and uncomfortable and foreign to these kids because they've never had that. They don't know what that feels like. So when we think of like something that every child should have and grow from, these kids look at it as, I've never had this. This is totally foreign and weird. And it feels yucky. It feels yucky on the inside. It just feels very strange. And so when we work with these kids, we really have to be very careful that we're not triggering this shame response in them and basically saying, well, actually, you know, this is what you should have had all along. This should hopefully feel normal to you. But in reality, it doesn't. We have to be very careful with when we're working with this population so that we can help them to learn that what they've learned is survival. And they needed that to protect them. They needed that to keep them safe. But now we need the adults to be able to show them that they can be trusted and they will not fit in this box of this prototype that they think that they are supposed to have in a caregiver because that's all they ever had. And so it's really on the adult, it's really on the caregivers to be able to show them that they can be trusted to allow that relationship to start to blossom. What happens a lot of times with our kiddos when they spend so much time in care and so much time, and by in care, I mean like in the system of care and foster care and group home care, you know, and with all these service providers in and out, is most of our kids, like I said, have some varying degree of attachment. And so they're used to these service providers coming in and talking to them. And they're more used to those relationships than they are this caregiver loving relationship. And so we really, you know, at Camelot and in my program in particular, I have the luxury of working with, you know, caring and loving caregivers and parents who are wanting to elicit the change and help their children's brains heal from the trauma they've been exposed to. So that does kind of give me a unique ability to work with these families as a family system and to work with the kiddos and the parents together in family therapy to kind of help them to heal together and learn together and function together as this family unit. Because ultimately it really needs to be the family against the trauma, against healing the trauma and being able to, because we can heal the brain and we can heal from these things that have happened. Now, sometimes it will be lasting change and in terms of brain development, but there's always the possibility that different things can happen in the brain to heal towards a more neurotypical looking, you know, brain and child. And ultimately that's what we want for all of our kids so that they can be functional, healthy, successful adults. That's the goal. But sometimes we have to just have really realistic expectations in regards to how we're working with families. We have to meet them where they are, not where our expectations for them would be or where we want them to be. We kind of have to start where they are. And for these kiddos are so good at kind of like deflecting and using what we would term as like maladaptive coping skills, meaning they're like, oh, look over there, you know, we'll be sitting in session, especially on screen. And they'll be like, oh, did I talk to you about blah, blah, blah that happened? And they're trying to deflect you and take you on these tangents. And I like to call it join them on the crazy train. And sometimes we have to be, well, all the time, we have to be the one who can validate, but also kind of get them to step off the train with us and not go down all the twists and turns so that we can help them and gear them and guide them towards these relationships with their caregivers, which will ultimately help them with that foundation. I always like to start with kids and families at a point of explaining to them and talking about what's happening in their brain, what's happening in their bodies, giving them that kind of core foundation of understanding of themselves. And then all this other stuff, all this other kind of superficial, the mask that they wear, in terms of a lot of our teenagers will stick the hoodie up and tuck under, or just totally avert your eye contact or any kind of attention, or be very maybe verbally aggressive with you. All of this is kind of like a mask to protect them. And so that's why we really talk about them being survival skills. So when we start talking about kind of like that psychoeducation of understanding what's going on with them, sometimes it can kind of like let that fall down a little bit, because it's kind of talking about everybody, not like we need to talk about your brain and this, you know, quote unquote defectiveness, because they're not defective. Unfortunately, they've been exposed to things that have happened to them thus far in their lives. And this is a systemic, this is a family issue. This isn't a, we need to fix you issue. And so when we do that and we approach families that way and we approach our kiddos like that, it really helps them not to feel that automatic offensive or defensive response in what they're giving us, and helps them to kind of let those down, let their guard down a little bit, to kind of learn a little bit about themselves. And then we really try to talk about things foundationally in those family activities so that we can build attachment. I always like to describe to kids and families how, you know, attachment is like the foundation. If you're building a house, you know, you have to have that concrete foundation, like it is locked, it is solid. You have to have that foundation before you build the house. So we can't teach you like coping skills or different things to be able to, or remove these behavioral responses before we have the foundation. Because if I just start building willy-nilly, you know, I'm here in Florida, if I start building a house on sand, it's not going to go very far. We have to have that foundation. So when we have that foundation of attachment and connecting with that caregiver who's going to love and support, then we can start doing the building blocks, and we can start putting up the walls, and we can start adding the second story. And then we can start seeing some of these other things that they're utilizing as their survival skills kind of lessen over time. So I always talk to families about the ABCs of healing attachment. The A is attuned need meeting. And that's essentially saying when you're attuned to somebody, you can kind of like see what's going on with them. You can watch their body language. You can hear their tone of voice. You kind of understand when they're being triggered, or when there's a situation that might be a little extra hard for them. You know, we need to be able to help our caregivers to be attuned and meet the needs, the core need of what's going on with our kiddos. So that's what the A stands for. The B is belonging, helping our kids to feel like they belong somewhere. Unfortunately, by the time that we work with our kids and families, they have usually been in a multitude of placements and in situations, and their feeling of belonging is just, it's just non-existent, to be honest with you. They feel like they don't belong anywhere. And can you imagine adding on to that, being a teenager, going through hormonal changes and different things that are happening with you and your body in natural and normal development? And then you add on top of that, this lack of belonging to a family or belonging to someone or some, you know, like a unit. So we talk about that as being the B, and C is containment. And now I don't mean containment as in like, I'm going to contain you and put you in a box and keep you safe and bubble wrap you. I mean containment for the parents, as in I can handle whatever you say or whatever you do, and I will still love and protect you. This is really hard for our parents because, and I know this personally, because it feels really difficult to be that emotional support person for these children day in and day out. It can be very, very draining. And you kind of feel a little bit like a human punching bag sometimes, because guess what? Once they start feeling safe, they're going to start throwing all this stuff at you. So to kind of test the waters and make sure that you really are going to be the person who like sticks it out and will be able to help them to grow and heal from this. So excuse me. So that's usually easier said than done. That sometimes takes a village to make happen. And because this can feel very isolating for our caregivers when we're working with them in this population, it kind of feels like they're on an island themselves and that it might never get better. And so we always like to connect other families together and help them to kind of do life together so it feels more of like normalcy. Because when you're working with families who are trying to raise and be that person, that connected and positive attachment for children who have developmental trauma, the things that you experience are very different than parents of neurotypical kiddos. And so when you talk to and lean into those other types, like neurotypical families, they kind of look at you a little bit like you're crazy, like, why are you dealing with that? Because of all these great survival skills that our kids have come up with and managed on their own to keep them safe. And when we can like kind of pair them up with other families that are going through this at the same time, or maybe in different developmental stages, it helps them to feel like, okay, this is normal. Because a lot of our kids, as Dr. Powell had talked about in terms of the effects of trauma and the symptomology and the effects of different attachment styles, a lot of it can look very mirrored in different kids at different developmental stages. And another thing that we really need to focus on, especially as clinicians, is helping our families to prepare them for each developmental stage. Trauma is unfortunately something that will continue to resurface in developmental stages throughout childhood, especially when they are when we're talking about trauma from such a young age, even starting in utero, and it, you know, being kind of woven into that cellular level with them. You know, we really have to kind of help them to you know, band together and kind of make sure that we can all help each other to stay off this crazy train. So I'm going to, I can talk on and on and on about all of this, but I'm going to kind of wrap up there and allow for some dialogue and conversation and questions, just making sure that we can help those that are watching to better serve or prepare themselves to better serve the families that they will see in the future.
And thank you very much, Krista. We have a bit of a panel and we didn't get to introduce everyone. So before we go ahead and address some questions, we'll have some of our panelists introduce themselves. Dr. Parrow Tompkins.
Hi, everyone. You know, as soon as I'm about to speak, my neighbor starts, you know, drilling or doing yard work. Isn't that how it works? I'm so happy to be here. My name is Dr. Parrow Tompkins, Newly Tompkins. So that's why everyone forgets it. I am an assistant professor at the Nova Southeastern University Clearwater Tampa Bay campus. If you haven't been, would love to have you come see us. I am also a licensed mental health counselor. I work predominantly with Dr. Powell in the College of Psychology in the Department of Counseling. And I'd just like to say I spent about 12 years working in child welfare and community-based care and Department of Juvenile Justice, in homework, lots of stuff like that. And so I've transitioned into academia and providing clinical supervision for our students and in private practice. And just, I don't know, I'm just so encouraged when I talk to all of you at Camelot, because I know the good work that you're doing, and I'm remembering the hard battle that our clients and their families face. As you were talking, Chris, I was thinking about like grit. I remember reading a book about grit and how that is more important than intellect. It is more important than anything, and sort of this ability to stick to it. And so I talk a lot with clients and their families and my students about stick-to-itness being sort of a silly word, but the most critical thing, like the container. Anyways, you've gotten me lit up and excited. I'm happy to be here, and thanks.
And I am Austin Vanderlinden. I am a licensed clinical social worker in the Tallahassee office with Camelot. I am the clinical director. I have been in this field for probably 7 years now. And every day is a new day. It's just so amazing how, you definitely with these children, like Krista said, people are in and out and, they're moving around, but being able to impact, that child or, that teen and being that one consistent person in their life and just like helping them process what they've gone through and forming attachments is very rewarding. So, yeah.
And just in case somebody missed the introduction, Dr. Powell.
Hello, everybody. My name is Dr. Patrick Powell. I'm a professor in the College of Psychology in the Department of Counseling. That title gets longer every year, it seems like. I teach primarily at the Fort Lauderdale-Davie campus and the Tampa campus with Dr. Pero Tompkins in the clinical mental health counseling field. And I'm in private practice with a specialty focused on trauma. Again, thank you everyone for coming out. I know at 10 o'clock on a Saturday. Thanks again.
And Krista, they've heard from you, but feel free to self-introduce again.
Sure. I'm Krista Eckhoff. I'm the director of Camelot's Adoption Support Program. I'm also a clinician within the program and an adoptive parent.
And Dr. Les Ross just joined us from the Tampa campus as well. We do have a few questions that have come in early, and there's some questions in the chat. If you're listening, you are welcome to ask questions. We're going to try to pick up all your questions. And let me just start with one of the most appropriate, probably. What is the difference between being present in the room with a client versus telehealth? What have you noticed as clinicians?
I think that's a great question. I think in some ways it's very beneficial, and in some ways it kind of increases or forces us to increase our capacity for observation. But in other ways, in terms of the families that I work with, if we're just working with the majority of our families, actually my families in particular, are large sibling groups. And so it can be very difficult and quite complex to try to engage large sibling groups. And so when we kind of like piecemeal them and kind of do different age brackets developmentally, and we work with them clinically with the parents, it's actually easier via telehealth because it kind of forces them to not engage, the other kiddos to not engage. And be somewhere else and be busy somewhere else, as opposed to if I was there in person, it would be like, they want all the attention. And so it also helps our teens to kind of like hone in on the screen, which is a very familiar place for them. Let everybody else add into that too, because I know we all have different experiences.
Oh, please go ahead.
I was thinking immediately about the counselor's experience also, and how I think if we're being honest, I don't know who's on the call. So if you're a counselor or a case manager, or you're someone in direct care, if you're a foster mom, let us know in the chat box. But I think all of those roles, if you're working with someone online and transitioning from being in an office, it is such a sharp difference, particularly because dependent on your own life, right? We all have our own lives, and all of a sudden we're living in our own lives, entering your world, but still experiencing, right? When I first started off, here comes the lawnmower, and then there's a lizard, and I mean, so much of life is happening. And when I think about all of the mental noise that could potentially distract me from what's happening with my client, I know that my self-care, my attention, my focus has to be so much better in order to pick up on my client's nuanced behavior, or what they're expressing, or my supervisees that are distracted. Sometimes that's a piece of feedback that I can offer them as I see them across the screen from me also. So for me, when I hear that question, I think of myself, and I think of how intentional I've had to be given the new environment. I could talk about that for days, but I think really setting, just as I would in a session when I would go into an office, I would set the stage, right? I'd fluff a pillow, maybe light a candle or a diffuser, turn on the lamps, get that horrible overhead, you know, like do things to set my intention and be present. I have to still do those things online and really be firm with the rest of the people in my life that this is a no enter zone. Go ahead, sorry, Pal.
Well, that word presence is interesting in this discussion. When I think presence, what I primarily think about is, are the client and myself, are we both present in terms of that moment and in that emotional interaction? And I think having a space like your office, it's a little easier to do that. When you're at home, you have so many things that are happening around you that kind of distract you and pull your attention away from that person that is sitting across from you. I think in this day and age with Zoom, I think you have to be very intentional about maintaining that presence. So when I talk to my clients in some of their initial sessions, I'll talk to them about ways that we are going to do that in the absence of being face-to-face. But I do want to say that, you know, in terms of mental health programs, most mental health programs are training their counselors to see people face-to-face. So in terms of training programs, a lot of counseling programs are having to do some catch-up to really help people understand how to do things like maintain a relationship across a screen, diagnose across a screen, that sort of thing. Treat someone using whatever your preferred method of treatment is. So training programs are finding it a little challenging as well as, you know, the general populace. But I do want to say that I think it's necessary. I mean, of course it's necessary right now with COVID, but without telecounseling, there are people that would never see counseling. There are people that live in remote areas that would never have access to help. There are people with anxiety issues that aren't ready to see someone face to face. So regardless of whether we're talking about COVID or, you know, presumably once this passes and we're all in a safer place and life maybe looks a little bit different, I think telecounseling is something that everyone needs to become familiar with, because some of your clients, they just may not show up otherwise.
Or they don't have the resources to be able to get to you. I think that's a big thing we've seen with our outlying counties is with telehealth, it's helped us tremendously with that. But you know, at times, you know, I would like to see my trauma kids in person, you know, because I can experience that stuff with them. But then, like you said, there's some kids that are so anxious that they don't even want to go outside. They don't want to leave their room, you know? So it really does have its benefits. I mean, it has its benefits and it has some downs, but I think it is something that we're all going to have to eventually train and just continue our education in.
Austin,
please go ahead.
Austin said something interesting. You said, in the room, like, I can feel it. I can feel the trauma. I can feel their pain, things like that. And someone in the chat box I was just reading, just coincidentally, asked a question about vicarious trauma. And I know we don't necessarily maybe have facts on this now, but interesting research idea. But are you experiencing less sort of, do you imagine that we will have less vicarious trauma concerns as we work with this screen in front of us?
I think for me personally, it's easier for me to, because I have like a physical barrier, I'm able to, I can empathize with you, and I understand where, let's go through this together, tell me. And, but I feel like I don't have that secondary trauma as much as I would if I was in the room with them and really like dancing. I don't want to say dancing it with them, because I am doing that as well. But for me personally, it has felt that I haven't experienced as much as being on the computer. And I feel like I'm able to compartmentalize better because I'm actually physically able to exit my screen. And it's like, okay, as soon as I hit exit, I'm done with this for right now. So that's just, you know, personally me.
So I feel like for me, it's a little bit harder because of how maybe we broach our families, because Austin and I are dealing with two very different populations, even though all of our kids are trauma exposed. So for me, we normally come in, like our sessions really have to be much more like animated and involve like the mind and the body and movement and all of this. So it's, For me, I have to like focus so much harder when I'm through the screen because I have to have things prepared and ready. We decided in the beginning of this that we were going to drop off like toolkits for our families. So like different therapeutic games that we use and workbooks and stuff that we use, because it's like, okay, we can play games, but it's like, I'm going to hold these cards up to you every single time and do different things, because a lot of our kids have such strong survival skills that we got to like break through a little bit by doing these things to kind of calm their brains down. So, even though I totally see the same benefits that you see, Austin, that you can kind of like click out, I feel like I can't turn my brain off as much because I'm constantly trying to think of new ways to continue to engage and navigate and help the parents. There's so much more homework on the end of my parents virtually than there is in person. And so that takes much more thought and practice for myself to continue to encourage them and get them to do it, you know, because it's like they're already doing so much and they feel so burned out. And so it's like less off my plate, but yet more on my plate, you know, at the same time. So it's kind of conflicting and very different.
As you probably know, the Jetsons predicted the future. Are we there? Is this going to continue, or this is the future and you're just going to accept it? What do you think?
I do have a thought on that. I think it's very possible to maintain a healthy counseling relationship and for someone to come out of that being in a better place with telecounseling. But I think the chance for outcomes, I think that increases with a face-to-face relationship. There's a book called The Heart and Soul of Change. And if any of you haven't read it, I recommend you pick it up. But they looked at a multitude of studies in terms of what leads to positive therapeutic outcomes. And if you're in the mental health field, it's a pretty well-known book, so you may have read it. But one of the things that they read is roughly about 30% of that outcome is due to the relationship. And that relationship is just, I don't want to say it's easier to maintain, but it builds itself, in my experience, a little better whenever you're actually in a room with someone. You know, we can recognize emotion and things like that, and we can feel for a person over the screen. I think it's different though when you're sitting in a room with someone and they are crying and they are upset and they look at you right across from them and they can see that you understand that place. Mm-hmm. So is this the future? I think it's one aspect of the future, but I definitely hope that that potential for being back in a room with a client is there again, because personally, I think it leads to a better outcome.
Can you speak to the strengths and challenges with diagnosing via telehealth? Recognizing different symptoms, trauma symptoms, a little bit of the detail with diagnosing.
I would say, I know just with us, it is a struggle, you know, because at times trauma, the symptoms can look very closely like ADHD or oppositional defiance, or, you know, and so you always want to look through a trauma lens, but then, you know, you don't see half the time if you have a child that's ADHD who really hasn't experienced trauma, but you're like, have they or have they not? It's kind of one of those things where you're trying to still figure out, but you don't see their hands, you know, tapping, or their feet, or, you know, or maybe they just, and our kids so love like tablets and phones and like technology. So you can put them in front of a screen and they're good, but mom says, no, if he's doing something I need him to do, or, you know, vice versa, he doesn't, or they don't do it, or they don't follow directions. But when we have on this, you know, hour and a half doing our intake, they're here and they're able to engage because they just are fascinated with the screen. So it's like one of those things where it's great because, you know, you can reach those people who really need it, or those people who are, you know, super depressed or anxious and they're at their house and they won't leave. But then it's hard too, because you have these kids and, you know, are they just did they just have a bad day? Or, you know, you can't see other things that they need to meet criteria for and the DSM. So.
Yeah, I think diagnosing in general is more difficult with a screen. I'll give you a couple examples. When you think about kids that that mature, again, some of those kids with trauma are going to develop other comorbid issues. And a lot of diagnosis does require observation. So for example, people that have obsessive compulsive disorder, and for those of you that aren't familiar with that, people that have recurring thoughts or images that are upsetting, and then they'll have a behavioral piece that they do to reduce that anxiety. Some people do it just by doing this or doing something with their hands. And from here, you can't see that. So there are a number of behaviors that people do that you don't really see across the screen. You can't see what people are doing to minimize their anxiety. You just can't see a number of things. So I think it is more challenging. You can conduct an interview where I can ask about symptoms and I can ask you on a 1 to 5 scale, like how difficult is it or how much does it impact you? But some things you're just not going to see.
Tell us about strengths, challenges, positive aspects pertaining to the engagement with the individual and family. I imagine there's got to be some positives and some challenges. So what would they be?
Are you asking what are the positives or challenges of engaging across like this sort of Zoom equipment?
Yes, yeah, with telehealth.
So I can say I can tell you with telehealth, we've actually had to, some of the parents that would just like, oh, go ahead, go to your therapy. I'm going to do my own stuff out in the lobby, or, you see them at school. Now you're really forcing the parents to show up and participate. And so much of it, like Krista said, it's the family. It is that, the parents really, research shows that you have so much better outcome when you have that parent caregiver involvement. So now you're really making them be involved and really asking them to be an active participant. So that's one thing for me that I'm like, I love it, because we're doing this together. We're a team, and you're going to be actively learning things as well to support this child.
I think a key is slowing down. As we move to this platform, a lot of what we do is nonverbal. Like you can see a lot of us counselors in here doing this, right? But we don't have sort of the banter. We've interrupted each other a few times. We've had to negotiate sort of who speaks when. And so I think as we shift, at least for the foreseeable near future, to committing to this work, I think one of the benefits is we have to slow down, or challenges, benefits, perhaps, who knows how you view that, but we have to slow down. I think too, when I'm working with teenagers, I loved in-home work because I got to see a piece of really who they were, unfiltered. And so I always tell students, when you have the honor of going in, you haven't earned the right to hear anybody's story, right? You work for that. And so when you have the honor of going into someone's home and seeing how they live, you get to admire sort of the decorations that they've chosen, or the trips that they've taken or haven't taken, who's in the pictures, who sits where, you get a lot of information. And I think the same could be true, particularly in teenagers. A lot of times teenagers are not bashful about being in treatment. They identify, I remember being at the mall and my teenagers would be like, that's my therapist, just run up. There's not really this concern always. But when you have them on a screen, they're on a tablet or they're on whatever, they might want to show you some things. And so I think it's an opportunity to let them take some initiative and show you some items that are really important to them, if you can slow down. So I know it's not, I hear your concern, Dr. Powell, about like building the rapport, but I do think being more flexible in how that's built, particularly with teenagers, is a strength, or a possible strength.
Yeah, as with anything, I definitely think there's some pros and cons. Some of the ones I've experienced, confidentiality is just, it's a little more rigorous in terms of maintaining that. So when I'm working with someone across the screen, I genuinely don't know who else is in that room. Now, confidentiality is, the client, it's owned by the client. So if they choose to have other people in there, they choose to have other people in there. There may be things that they've told me in previous sessions that I bring up, not knowing who else is in that room. that may cause issues. Sometimes we have to provide response to crises. If I have someone that's homicidal, suicidal, psychotic, I may have to address that through hospitalization or some other means. And if I have someone that is a distance away, that might prove a little difficult. Here in Florida, we have practitioners that are seeing people from out of state. It's very unlikely that they would be able to get here to manage that sort of thing. And even if I have someone on the other tip of Florida, it may take me, 3 or 4 hours to get over there during a crisis. So there definitely are some challenges to it. Add on to that, individuals that have individuals that may not be able to afford internet services, a computer, that sort of thing, a phone, they may not be able to engage in these services. But in terms of benefits, I think of the best benefit is it is a technology that we can use to engage people when we would not otherwise be to. And my perspective has always been that any therapeutic interaction is better than none.
Is there any stories you want to share, experiences that might lend to other practitioners out there or future counselors?
Yeah, there was a question specifically for Krista about how you teach parents about the ABCs and sort of what that might look like. So I'm sure you have a story about that.
Yeah, well, we actually, in our program, we really look at the clinician as like the mentor, like the coach. Like we're going to partner up with the parents so that the parent is the ultimate healer, and actively working to help their child and their family heal. And so a lot of things that we do, it is more difficult because like on the screen versus in the home, because we might play like simple games like Simon Says or what's the one, like Red Rover, whatever, like just simple games to kind of break the ice a little bit and do a little bit of like call recall and kind of like question and answer specifically with the parents. And we also do different activities. We have plethora of therapeutic games depending on what is going on with the family. When we're laying that groundwork, we do a lot of different arts and crafts activities with the family together, like kind of creating a family mantra, talking about what do we stand for as a family, talking about the rules of the family, because guess what? A lot of times we get into the home and these families have like all these different expectations and rules. And we're like, okay, can we have one rule that just says everybody gets to be safe and everything falls underneath that? And what does that look like? And just helping things not to feel so overwhelming. We do a lot of modeling when we're sitting around playing a game or noticing. So when we're playing a game, it gives me an opportunity. A lot of times, like probably 70% of the time I'll play with them. But 30% of the time I won't, because it gives me an opportunity to observe what's going on and then model or call out or draw attention to different things that are going on with different family members. That's how you kind of teach attunement in figuring out like, oh, okay, so I'm noticing that you kind of felt a little uncomfortable there. Was that question really hard? That question kind of felt a little icky to me in my stomach, or you know what, I'm feeling kind of weird. We might need to do a little exercise really quickly. Can you do that with me? And putting it on myself as the model of when I feel these feelings, I'm going to utilize these skills. So in giving these, it also gives these kids a sense of belonging because they have that family component that is there with them together. We're doing it together. You're not isolated out. We don't have to fix you and then put you back in once you're fixed. And then it's a lot of sessions with just the parents and parent coaching and helping them to understand their own insecurities, their own stuff. We use a parent stress index with our families that kind of gives us a guide as to where they're feeling the most stress. And then we go over it with them and talk about it with them and say, we're going to specifically target these areas and help you in these areas to reduce stress so that you can be as full as possible to help your kiddos. Because when we don't know our own stuff, and even clinicians, when we don't know our own stuff, and parents, we don't know our own stuff, we can't help our kids and we can't help our families because we're dealing with this conflict, this inner conflict that is causing an issue, and it's coming out in different ways that we respond to people and that we engage with people. So hopefully that answered whomever's question. But they laugh at me at the office because my clinician office, I can't even, I have bookshelves and bookshelves and bookshelves. And even right here, like for clinical, I have all sorts of different, like, I am constantly like working through different games and activities and cards and workbooks and stuff. Once we get to that level that we can start implementing some of these things, you have to change it up and think on your toes. And nobody likes things to be stagnant in general.
And I think, Krista, you hit an awesome point. Someone asked, like, what have you learned about yourself as a therapist during this pandemic? And how has this recognition helped you in your work with clients? You've got to be flexible. Like, I have learned that I have to have my stuff planned out. And if the client that day is not having it, I have B and C and D, and just being flexible. Yeah, definitely.
I've learned the power of countertransference too, right? Like, this is a time, like, for anyone on this call, know that anxiety during this time is totally normal. And hearing that some of you have typed that it's your first client that you're going to see, you've just taken a job with Camelot, someone posted on here, and you just got your first 2 clients. Like, I hope that you understand that this shared experience of anxiety right now, we're all worried about our own health. And oh gosh, like, it's just so real. And how to contain that. Like, Krista, you talked about containment for the parents providing a container for the children. But we have to do that for ourselves. We have to be so good with boundaries and self-love and patience right now. And I am not great at any of those. So what have I learned about myself? That I'm a doer and I don't like to be trapped in one place. So I don't like feeling caged. And so it did give me quite a bit of empathy for folks who don't have mobility or don't have the freedom to get up and go for other reasons in life. So that was an interesting thing for me to think about for my clients. But it's not often that clinicians are dealing with the same stressor as their clients at the same time. Yeah. And at this moment in history, we are all having a shared COVID experience. Worse for some, like, it's a different experience for everyone, but no one is getting out unaffected.
Carlos, I'd like to address one of the questions. I just happened to glance over at the chat and it looks like there's a number, but there's one that caught my eye. How do we train adoptive parents of teens in foster care that decide to adopt? I've worked with a number of people that have made that decision. And there's a lot to cover, but there's just a couple points I'd like to make. I think the key thing that I would really focus on with those parents is the understanding that this is going to be a significant process. These children are coming into this, they're likely coming into the foster care relationship with certain expectations, let alone an adoption relationship with expectations. Some of these children may not have the healthiest of ways to attach. They may have a difficult time looking at you and reaching that point that, most adoptive parents want, where someone looks at you and goes, Mom, Dad, that sort of thing. It might take that child a while. So it definitely takes perseverance. I would have a very frank conversation with those parents about, when you think about caring for this child, one of the things that this child likely needs is a caregiver that is going to be permanent. And regardless of whatever frustration or anger, irritability comes from this child, that is going to be there and be that source of healthy attachment for them. So I would really work with the parents to see, are you at that place where you could be that source and you could be that type of parent? I've worked with a few situations where people have adopted children that were in foster care in different situations, and they weren't aware of what would happen, and they really expected that child to just come in and move into a room and be automatically their son. And they didn't necessarily do the best whenever source of healthy attachment, whenever their children didn't just fit in that mold automatically and show up for dinner. So I would have a very frank conversation about some of the emotional challenges, some of the expectations, and I would have a conversation with them of, do you feel you can do this? I don't know if any of the other panelists have a thought on that.
I would say if you want to be a savior, you're probably not going to be successful.
No. I have lots of thoughts on that, actually, because I train adoption competency and trauma-informed care in the community here in Hillsborough County. And in Hillsborough County, we have an amazing pre-adoptive training that is a 12-week, it's mandatory for all pre-adoptive families. And I was lucky enough to be asked to train on trauma in the brain for that, those particular families, to just really help solidify and help them to understand, because they go in there like doe-eyed and starry-eyed, and I'm going to save all these kids and I'm going to do all this wonderful thing, all these wonderful things. And then, you know, they just kind of like gloss over the real core of what it's like to live this day in and day out. I mean, I worked in the system of care for over 15 years. I saw this day in and day out, and it is still, completely unprepared for living it day in and day out. And still my expectations were not where they should have been. And so we have to constantly be analyzing ourselves as parents to these children, especially teenagers, because sometimes with teenagers, what you see is what you get. And it's oftentimes the case. And when we have expectations that are way too high for them to meet, we're destroying that relationship with them. We have to really meet them where they are and meet the need. And I always talk to families about, when you can meet the need behind the behavior, we can extinguish the behavior over time. So we really need to look at, okay, they might be doing X, Y, and Z, which is driving you absolutely insane, but what is the core need here? Where do we need to go here? And helping them to understand that it really is reframing and restructuring areas of their brain that were deprived. And when we can really get families to understand that and see it from a different perspective, that I'm not against my child, it's not my child who's driving me crazy, even though it feels like it's my child who's driving me crazy. It's really all this other stuff, the package that comes with that we just need to work that much harder to try and, you know, and fix and heal. And sometimes we'll only get so far, and that's okay. And we have to be, as parents, we have to be okay with that. You know, Carly, you said stick-to-itiveness, and ironically, that is one of the top personality traits of successful adoptive parents. A sense of humor, realistic expectations, flexibility, and communication skills. Do you know that divorce is sky high in adoptive families? You know, in the United States, I think it's what, like 50%? It's more like 75 to 80 in adoptive families. Like, it is insanely high. So then you add that on top of all this other stuff, you know, and we just really need to work with parents to give them these realistic expectations that set them up for success and get them sooner rather than later, you know, pre-adoptive phase as opposed to post-adoptive phase. I have to tout on my program for a second here. Post-adoptive, in the 4 years my program has been in existence, we've never had a kiddo go back into care that we've worked with clinically. So pre-adoptive in the state of Florida, 40% of kids disrupt pre-adoptive. That's a huge percentage. So it really is about education, and just getting that information out there.
And about support, right? You guys offer a ongoing support group.
Forever, right? Yeah. We never go away, really. I mean, we might bow out clinically. We try not to be in the home clinically for more than like 6 months to 9 months, because then it just becomes like kind of like a codependent relationship. So we try to do, you know, plant some seeds, do some give and take. And then when they need us, we kind of will pop back in. But we do support groups, multiple. We do live virtual groups on Facebook every week to support our families. We do evening support groups a couple times a month to support our families, to kind of meet them where they are. And we try to pour into their kids as much as we possibly can to support what they're doing. So yeah, we really try to be like all encompassing in terms of like just wrapping them in the support so that they feel like, okay, I can do this. Yeah, this is hard. And yeah, sometimes I just want to run screaming from my house, but I can do this. I can wake up refreshed the next day and get right back in the trenches.
And I think that you had said something like, you know, they have these behaviors, and, you know, we got to figure out communication and all that. And I think it's so important. I remember telling one of my adoptive parents there, I've told him, I'm like, look, this child is an expert in their life. You know, they are the expert. So what, you can't tell them, or you can expect something out of them right now. That's just not realistic. but like they are the expert in their life. They have learned these things to survive. And so just getting that through to the parents and like getting that open communication and just allowing them to, and help facilitating, you know, that relationship and stuff. I think that's so important when it comes to like just anybody in general. And, you know,
So we're approaching 11:30, and we mentioned that our program would end. I just want to give everyone there's some folks that asked for resources. So if you check the chat box, they were looking for games and different activities. Go ahead and share, but please give us just a final word and thought for the day.
You want us to give a final word and thought?
Yes, please, panelists.
Sure.
And just one last question I have we experienced just a growing need of foster care and adoptive parents in Florida? Is it a crisis? I'm avoiding media these days. Is it absolutely crisis, or what's the situation?
It is always a crisis to have foster and adoptive families to meet the needs of our children in care. Unfortunately, the numbers don't stop. Children don't stop being removed. I wish we could work so hard to negate the effects of trauma to where we don't have any removals, but unfortunately that is something that we will never experience in our lifetime, I'm sure. So we are forever needing foster and adoptive families, because honestly, probably about half of our foster families become adoptive families and then they have no room to foster again. So we need this to constantly be an influx of amazing families that come in and work with our kiddos.
And not only that, but not just like traditional foster, parents, like we need therapeutic ones. And those are like the ones that are willing to take on children that do have these behaviors that are really hard to manage, but we need people that are willing to go out and say, I can do this because I'm going to have a huge support behind me. And, like our Tallahassee office, we only do therapeutic because there's so many kids in our area that have so many behaviors and so many things because of the trauma they've experienced, and they need placements, and they've blown all of traditional placements, and now they don't have any, there's no homes up here. So now you're taking them out of their own environment and putting them down south. And then that's another thing. So it's, we just need people not only for traditional, but, therapeutic, even medical. There's just so many out there that we're always needing.
My closing thought is I hope you all stay connected. To everyone online, I hope that this was encouraging and useful and edifying, that you remember that we are cheesy, but we're all in this together. And in the event that you do need additional support, or you need to talk about it, you just need support, I really encourage you to ask for it. We are always welcoming at the Nova Southeastern University campus. Would love to see you. And Camelot is an incredible resource. So I hope that you know that we're all here.
I guess the only thing that I would say, it's been good spending the morning with all of you. Those of you I can't see, and of course the panelists. The thing that I would take away from this for everyone is that trauma is often unseen, but it is pervasive. So when you see someone that is struggling, or when you see someone that may have experienced something that you would even consider traumatic, it might be worth checking in on that person and just seeing how they're doing. And if any of you are in the clinical field and you have the opportunity to work with the child and you start to suspect a trauma, it might be appropriate to kind of explore a little bit and see if that's an underlying issue, because we frequently just see it as depression, anxiety, or many other things that don't fit into that DSM definition of a traumatic reaction. Otherwise, have a good morning, everybody.
Just as you said that, I'm texting a relative that lost someone.
Oh, gotcha. Excellent.
Thank you, Dr. Pell.
Cool.
So thank you all for joining us, and keep in touch. We are Nova Southeastern University. We have bachelor's, master's, doctorate specialists in many programs and clinics here in Fort Lauderdale. So definitely keep in touch. Kelsey, keep in touch, and Les, we'll see you in Tampa. And
thanks everybody.
Thank you guys.
Thank you.